Good evening. I'm Mike Perry. I'm the president of the Army Heritage Center Foundation. The foundation is the Friends Group for the U.S. Army Heritage Education Center, the Army's premier research repository dedicated to telling the Army story one soldier at a time. Tonight, we're moving back into the early part of the 20th century. We have Betsy Smoot. She is an intelligence historian interested in the early 20th century cryptology and communications, and she has published in both Cryptology, I'm going to mess that up, and Intelligence and National Security. She has spent 34 years at the National Security Agency as an analyst, manager, and then for her final 10 years as historian for the Center of Cryptologic History. Betsy is the author of tonight's topic, Parker Hitt, the father of American military cryptology, and in the near future, a second book, From the Ground Up, American Cryptology During World War I. Betsy holds a BA from Mary Washington College and an MS in Strategic Intelligence for what is now the National Intelligence University. Betsy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike, and everybody at the Army Heritage Center Foundation for having me here tonight. I plan to talk for about 45 minutes to leave room for questions and comments, and I'll try to stay on track. So I'm going to give you an overview of Parker Hitt's career and a flavor for my biography of Hitt, with some extra focus on his Army experiences. It'll be somewhat informal ramble through Hitt's life. Hitt was famous in his time, but is largely unknown today. His name appeared in newspapers for decades for his heroics in the Philippines and World War I, yet history has largely forgotten him. So this picture is my favorite of Hitt, sitting on his porch at Fort Leavenworth. In the background of the picture is his first Cipher device. Hitt did not consider himself a cryptologist. He considered himself an infantry soldier. Even after his success as chief signal officer in the American Expeditionary Forces First Army during World War I, he made the decision to stay infantry rather than switch to signals. Cryptologic historians have tended to discount his role in early 20th century cryptology, apart from his manual for the solution of military ciphers, though David Kahn sang his praises in his book, The Codebreakers. No one had previously examined his entire career to understand the true contributions Hitt made to cryptology. Sorry, this is not, there we go. How I came to write about Hitt. My first week on the job in the Center for Cryptologic History in October 2007, I heard the NSA historian give a talk that included mention of Parker Hitt. My first thought was to wonder if he was related to my husband, who has a Hitt line, and indeed he is. My husband is fourth cousin, twice removed to Parker. So I started researching Parker as a genealogist would, looking for where he was buried, and I couldn't find him. A former colleague of mine lived near Front Royal, Virginia, where the Hitts had retired, and I asked him if he could poke around a little bit. So in late 2008, early 2009, my former colleague connected me to the director of the Warren County Heritage Society, who had been asked about 5 years previous to that to help him organize some material that was a trunk of Hitt's papers. And it turned out the Mormon and Mustaine families were the key to the whole project. They had bought land from Mary Lou Hitt, Hitt's daughter, in the 1970s and became friends. And then when Mary Lou died, they inherited her estate, including everything in the house, including trunks of papers. So they let me tour the house and have access to the trunk and other material, which was a gold mine for a historian. I made, I think, 10 visits to Front Royal to examine the papers and to scan them in the summer of 2009. The clue to Hitt's importance to modern cryptology comes in a dedication the great cryptologist William F. Friedman wrote in Hitt's copy of William and Elizabeth Friedman's book, The Shakespearean Ciphers Examined. Friedman says Hitt is the father of modern American military cryptology. In an earlier letter to Hitt, thanking him for a signed picture, Friedman said Hitt was the father of cryptanalysts of the American Army, in the American Army. So you see here a photo of William and Elizabeth Friedman at the time the book was released, and a photo of their inscription, and then I've typed it out for you, the relevant portion. As you may be aware, Friedman is one of the greatest American cryptologists of the 20th century. He was the man who led the Army's Signal Intelligence Service to its breakthroughs against Japanese cipher machines during World War II, and the de facto grandfather of the National Security Agency. It's Friedman who is usually thought of as the father of American cryptology. William and Elizabeth Friedman, however, when tasked with teaching cipher work to officers at Riverbank Laboratories in Illinois in late 1917 and early 1918, at the beginning of World War I for the American side, used Hitt's Manual for the Solution of Military Ciphers as their course guide, keeping a chapter ahead of their students as they themselves learned the business. Friedman's respect for Hitt was so great that in late 1944, he expedited a job for Hitt's daughter, Mary Lou, at Arlington Hall Station, the home of the Signal Security Agency. Mary Lou, after having tea with Friedman, wrote to her parents saying, "I give you my word that the lowliest lieutenant stepping within the gates is taught about Pop first, and then, much later, about his own particular duties and God." Was Friedman right about Hitt? Let's look at Hitt's career. So here we have Hitt as a baby in 1878, as a toddler about 1880, and as a young man, the date is unknown. Hitt was born into a middle-class, politically and socially active family in Indianapolis, Indiana in 1878. His father, George Cooper Hitt, was the business manager of the Indianapolis Journal and the first publisher for the Hoosier poet James Whitcomb Riley. In his youth, George had served as a secretary for one of the early Army expeditions exploring Yellowstone. Parker's mother, Elizabeth Barnett, left her Massachusetts home to become a physical education teacher at the high school in Omaha, Nebraska. The couple met in Omaha. George's older brother, Wilbur, was a Civil War veteran who fought at Vicksburg and an avid outdoorsman. Parker learned a lot from him. George Hitt had a small role in the presidential campaign of Benjamin Harrison, and George and Parker traveled on Harrison's inaugural train from Indianapolis to Washington when Parker was 10. When Parker was 12, George became vice consul general to his friend and newspaper owner John C. New at the U.S. Embassy in London. New's son, Harry, who also worked at the paper, would later become a U.S. senator and postmaster general. Parker attended the University College School while the family was in London, but on his return to Indianapolis in early 1892, the 13-year-old Hitt joined the freshman class at Indianapolis High School No. 1, a co-educational, racially integrated school, which was later renamed Shortridge High School. Hitt had just turned 17 when he entered Purdue University as part of the class of 1899. Here he majored in civil engineering and participated in the Cadet Corps, which was the predecessor to the ROTC. He was a straight-A student, and according to the university's president, a young man of fine personal character and of conduct and habit above reproach, as well as rather mature in his judgments with, what is rare, a good deal of common sense. In the summer of 1898, having completed his junior year at Purdue, Hitt abruptly left school and enlisted in the U.S. Army. Why? No, he never really says why. This, of course, is at the beginning, the beginning of the Spanish-American War. He tried for a commission, but since he wasn't 21, he wasn't selected. You had to be 21, despite the fact that he passed the exams. He was mustered instead into the 2nd U.S. Volunteer Engineers as a sergeant on July 1st, the day of the battles of San Juan Hill and El Caney in Cuba. But he didn't get to Cuba until the end of the year. Instead, the engineers worked to build the Camp Wyckoff on Montauk Point on Long Island, which was a quarantine camp for soldiers returning from Cuba. He helped construct Camp Columbia in Havana, however, and he later remembered the sanitary horrors of our camps and the inefficiency of our commanders and supply agencies in the field, and remarked that most of the hardships of war are found off the battlefield. He was mustered out in April 1899, determined to become a commissioned officer. With some help from a family friend, Senator Charles W. Fairbanks, he achieved his goal and at the end of 1899 set off as a 2nd lieutenant to serve in the Philippines. Hitt had 2 tours in the Philippines with the 22nd Infantry, separated by a period of home service. During his first tour, he was stationed on Luzon, where he won fame for a February 1901 encounter with a band carrying messages for Philippine President Emilio Aguinaldo. Hitt's men were poised to surround and capture the group, and he ordered his men to hold their fire. But according to Hitt, one of his men had his finger too close to the trigger and a rifle cracked on the left. Hitt gave the order to fire, and after 3 volleys, they found most of the band had fled up the mountain pass, abandoning food, ammunition, and a pack of more than 200 letters. The capture of this group on the other side of the mountain shortly after Hitt's engagement resulted in the discovery of enciphered messages. General Frederick Funston's breaking of these messages led to the capture of Aguinaldo himself. Hitt did not have anything to do with breaking these messages and never claimed to have done so, though others, including David Kahn, have claimed that Hitt broke the messages. That's just not true. Later in 1901, Hitt was the officer who located and recovered the remains of Navy seaman Denzel Benville, an action for which he was commended by the Secretary of the Navy. Benville was part of a party from the USS Yorktown, which had been ambushed in April 1899. Hitt's unit received information from some prisoners they held that enabled them to locate Benville's partial remains, and they constructed a rock pyramid and cross and cut an inscription on a tree to mark the place. And Hitt was the one who then had to gather the remains and seal them in a box and send them home. On the left is a sketch and a map that Hitt prepared of the site. While on Luzon, he developed sciatica and rheumatism after a typhoon in October 1901. These ailments would bother him for the rest of his life, but did not impair his ability to serve. Hitt's second tour was on Mindanao, where he received a Silver Star for gallantry for an attack on Moro forts on the Taraca River in April 1904. He vied with other junior officers to be the first to land while fearlessly exposing themselves to fire. The picture on the left was taken shortly after the engagement. I've highlighted Hitt in pale green. The battle aggravated his hip and leg problems, and as a result, he was put in charge of Army water transportation on Lake Lanao, gaining a reputation as the Admiral of Lake Lanao, and he assisted in raising Spanish gunboats from the lake's floor. He used the small lake fleet to transport troops, run a ferry service, and engage in battle. Someone, possibly Hitt, drew this humorous portrait and composed a verse in the Admiral's honor. Though really the artist is unknown, but I think it might have been Hitt. After the Philippines, Hitt stayed with the 22nd Infantry. He spent time on the rifle range at Point Bonita in California, and it was here he began to learn about telephony, or telephones, helping to run telephone cables on the range. After the April 1906 San Francisco earthquake, he briefly supervised a refugee camp in San Francisco. And then he attended the New School of Musketry at the Presidio of Monterey, where he developed an expertise in all aspects of machine gun work and stayed on at the school as an unofficial teaching assistant. Some of his range findings were used by Captain John Henry Machine Gun Parker in his writings. He also invented a device to water-cool machine guns. During this time, he participated in the Army deployment to the mine strikes at Goldfield, Nevada. And this picture is a great one that a colleague found in the National Archives, showing Hitt is crouching behind the gun and another officer is holding the hose, testing his water-cooled device. When the 22nd left California, Hitt led a company at Fort Davis in Nome, Alaska. And this picture is at the officers' mess in Nome, an officers' club in Nome. Hitt is in the back row on the left. Hitt was very tall. He was about 6'4", so you can always find him in a picture. He brought radio equipment with him to Alaska and taught himself about radio, and then spent time with the Signal Corps men in Nome and at the nearby radio station at Safety, Alaska. He began to dream of attending the signal school because he was interested in aviation, and at the time the Signal Corps was responsible for Army aviation. In 1910, 12 years into what was a fairly typical infantry career, Hitt moved with the 22nd to Fort Sam Houston, where his life would change. He transferred to the 10th Infantry, hoping for a slot at the School of the Line at Fort Leavenworth. He was part of the Maneuver Division in the spring of 1911, and he participated in a small, short aviation program at Fort Sam Houston. He was finally promoted to captain, and while in San Antonio, he met and married Genevieve Young. He didn't get to the School of Line, but was sent to the Signal School. Before we move on to the Signal School, talk a little bit about Genevieve. These pictures show her at an age about, from left to right, at about 6. An unknown date, probably her wedding photograph. One's probably a debutante picture, one's probably a wedding photograph, and the last one is at Leavenworth when she was pregnant with their daughter, with Parker. Genevieve Young was a doctor's daughter who was raised in San Antonio, Texas. She had always vowed not to marry an Army officer, but admitted, "I didn't know Parker Hitt then." The two met in the autumn of 1910, just before Hitt's transfer to the 10th Infantry became official, and with that his move to Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indianapolis in that December. When Parker returned to San Antonio in March 1911 to participate in the Maneuver Division, the newly promoted captain renewed his courtship in earnest. He proposed in May, and the two married quietly in July. "You must not expect much of me," Genevieve wrote to her future mother-in-law, saying she was just an ordinary girl. In fact, she noted Parker had made a mistake loving a Southern girl, for they are such a lazy bunch and awfully poor housekeepers, but we can love our men even if we can't make them comfortable. After a honeymoon in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and a visit to Hitt's family in Indiana, the newlyweds arrived at Fort Leavenworth in August 1911. Genevieve had a good secondary education and an aptitude for bridge, and seems to have enjoyed learning about codes and ciphers that Hitt studied in school. By 1916, she was assisting with cryptanalytic problems sent to Hitt from Washington. She rather underrated her own work, but when Parker went to Washington en route to France in May 1917, it was Genevieve, with her daughter Mary Lou, who traveled to Riverbank Laboratories to instruct their cipher section, including William and Elizabeth Friedman, in the use of Hitt's sliding strip device and how to read his manual for the solution of military ciphers. Genevieve offered her services to Ralph Van Diemen, head of the Military Intelligence Division, who said he'd keep her in mind for wartime work. And then she went home to live in San Antonio for the duration of the war. By August 1917, the Army's Southern Department was routinely, which was headquartered in San Antonio, was routinely sending Genevieve intercepted messages to solve. This was on an unpaid basis. But in April 1918, she was hired by the Southern Department's intelligence officer to be a code clerk. While the job primarily involved coding and decoding official messages, she continued to break messages intercepted by radio or postal censorship offices. In May 1918, she was sent to visit MI8 in Washington, where she had discussions with the chief there, Herbert O. Yardley, and one of the female cryptologists, Dr. Edith Rickert. Genevieve resigned her job after the armistice in November 1918 and never worked in cryptology again. When the Hitts lived in Washington in 1920, she briefly worked as a document indexer for J. Edgar Hoover in the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor of the FBI, but left that job shortly after Parker was promoted. In July 1940, with war on the horizon, she offered her services to the FBI, who decided she would not be of any material assistance in any emergency situation and did not act. Despite her short time in the world of work, her death certificate lists her occupation as retired code and cipher expert. That, of course, was Parker's doing. September 1911 to June 1915 was a great period of productivity and inventiveness for Hitt, who was first a student and then an instructor and sometimes the acting director of the Army Signal School at Fort Leavenworth. He invented both cylinder and strip cipher devices, built a portable telephone switchboard, which would be used during World War I, and spent several stints on the Mexican border. He was also identified as an Army cipher expert, a so-called shark on ciphers. Washington sent him Mexican messages to break, and Genevieve worked on these messages with him, becoming the first woman to break ciphers for the U.S. government, albeit on an unpaid basis. This picture shows the first iteration of Hitt's cylinder cipher device, which did not contain mixed alphabets. For those of you familiar with the Army cipher disk, it's just a cylinder form of the cipher disk multiplied to make it easier to code and decode messages. However, it gave him a lot of ideas, and he later developed different sets of alphabets to use on the disks. And Friedman called these alphabets the star cipher. And in 1913, he modified his device with the new alphabets. Joseph O. Moburn, who was an instructor at the Signal School and then later Chief Signal Officer of the Army, built stronger, more random sets of alphabets and created what was called the M94, the device you see in the lower right. He created that in 1918 using stamped metal as Hitt had originally proposed. And this device was formally introduced into Army usage in 1922 and used for decades, not just by the Army, but by the Navy and by the State Department. In the spring of 1914, using the principles of his cylinder cipher, Hitt built a strip cipher, and you see that on the left. The first model was about 7 by 4 inches and had 20 numbered sliding strips, each with a different mixed alphabet. His next version was 2 frames wide with 40 strips. On the left is the 1916 model, created so Parker and Genevieve could use it for telegrams when they were separated, though no examples of that usage has been found. Genevieve demonstrated this device to William and Elizabeth Friedman and to Herbert O. Yardley. While Genevieve had hoped that Yardley would approve of the device for use within the Southern Department for communications with the office in Mexico City because the code had been compromised, Yardley rejected the idea because he had a better idea. In 1938, William Friedman directed the construction of a strip cipher device with 25 strips. That's the M138A, which you see on the right. The Navy's version was called the CSP-845. So both devices were inspired by and derived from Hitt's work. As I said, Hitt's inventiveness was not contained to cipher devices. Among his many ideas were the 40-line portable switchboard. It's the camp switchboard used during World War I, and you can see that on the slide, how it packs up with, you can attach legs and it packs up into a suitcase and uses standard materials, so nothing special had to be built to operate it. He devised battery testing devices. He made improvements to the 1912 service buzzer. He adapted a formula related to signals to an easy to understand chart. He improved signal lanterns, and he probably did many other things that were not found in the official records. Hitt kept an idea book for students to use and to develop ideas, but I've never been able to find what happened to that book. What Hitt is most known for is the Manual for the Solution of Military Ciphers. His work and the lack of a standard text at the school led him to write this book, and it remained a standard work for the Army through World War II. It was meant to be a textbook for the Signal School, but it included a set of principles for establishing a code and cipher breaking effort, which I think are the first documented thoughts in the early 20th century for an Army signals intelligence operation. In a discussion of equipment for cipher work, Hitt emphasizes the importance of each field army having an office where all ciphers intercepted should be sent at once for examination. He places this work within the Army's intelligence section. He suggests that a special radio station with receiving instruments only should be an adjunct to this office, and its function should be to copy all hostile radio messages, whether in cipher or plain text. And he states this facility should operate 24 hours a day. Hitt was writing in 1915, describing a signals intelligence system that would not exist in the Army for some time yet. Though he spent years at the Signal School, he was still an infantry officer on detail, and he wanted to go back to the infantry. He did not move to the Signal Corps at the end of the detail, and in 1915, when he had to move, he went to be an instructor at the new School of Musketry at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, transferring to the 19th Infantry to do so. It was while he spent some time on the border with the 19th Infantry during the punitive expedition that Hitt met a young lieutenant who would become a lifelong friend. His name was Dwight D. Eisenhower. In May 1917, there was a fight for Hitt's services. And here we have a picture on the left of Hitt as the CSO of the First Army, and a picture from the National Cryptologic Museum Library of Hitt sitting on the back steps of the First Army telegraph trailer at Souy, France, during the Meuse-Argonne campaign. Ralph Van Diemen, who was in charge of the small military intelligence operation in Washington, wanted Hitt to head a Cipher bureau, what would become MI8, and on May 17th, ordered Hitt to report to him in Washington. But Hitt's old mentor from the signal school, Edgar Russell, had been chosen by General John J. Pershing to be the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, Chief Signal Officer, CSO, and Russell knew he wanted Hitt as his assistant. He had orders telegraphed to Hitt at Fort Sill under Pershing's signature on the same day that Van Diemen's orders were sent. Well, obviously, Pershing, Russell, and the AEF won the battle. On Hitt's first day in Washington, Russell and Hitt went to see Van Diemen, and Van Diemen was furious, called the adjutant general's office to protest. Russell and Hitt rushed back across town to Pershing's office, where Pershing also became upset, saying, "God damn the general staff, my staff goes with me," as he stormed out to find acting chief of staff Tasker Bliss. Van Diemen eventually settled for Herbert O. Yardley to run what became MI8. Hitt sailed on the RMS Baltic with Pershing's staff as an assistant to Russell. In France, Hitt and Russell laid the groundwork for all the communications needed for the AEF, liaised with the British and the French, and came up with both the idea for the AEF Signal Corps Research and Inspection Division and the use of female telephone operators in France, the Hello Girls. Now, there were three parts to cryptology in the AEF in France: collecting signals, including conducting direction finding, breaking code and cipher messages, and passing any intelligence derived from that on to other intelligence organizations, and cryptography, making new codes and ciphers for AEF use. Two of these functions, collection and cryptography, were traditionally Signal Corps duties, and Hitt had some involvement in the course of his normal work. The breaking of codes and ciphers was done by the G2A6, which was run by a former star pupil of Hitt's at the Signal School, Captain, later Colonel Frank Moorman. Hitt assisted all three parts of the operation, but most particularly the code compilation section. It was Hitt's alarm at the simplicity of the section's first attempt at a trench code that led to a famous test being set up using an officer from the G2A6. This test led to the creation of more secure trench codes, which were dubbed the River and Lake Systems series of codes. He undertook other cryptologic duties, which are discussed in my book. There are far too many. That could be a whole separate talk in and of itself. Now, when the AEF Signal Corps moved away from the AEF headquarters at Chaumont in the spring of 1918, Hitt was left behind to be Russell's eyes and ears at headquarters. He split his time between doing Signal Corps work and a position on the G3 operations staff as their communication and code specialist. Therefore, he was an observer at the battles of Château-Thierry, Cantigny, and the Second Battle of the Marne. It was during the summer of 1918, though, on July 12th to be exact, that Hitt first met William Friedman when the men were walking down the street near AEF headquarters in Chaumont. Friedman later wrote to his wife about the encounter with his idol and how flustered he was by the very tall man who towered above him. They did not meet again until after the war. Hitt became the chief signal officer of the First Army when that army was formed. It was his idea to take 6 female telephone operators from AEF headquarters to First Army headquarters and have them work the switchboards closer to the front. He wrote to them, "Kiss your happy homes goodbye and get ready for a roving life." After the battle at Saint-Mihiel, Hitt was walking down the street one day with General Pershing when the men encountered several of the telephone operators. Pershing wanted to know if the operators were happy being so close to the front, and the women assured him that they wanted to be closer. Pershing told Hitt to take them where they want to go, but of course Hitt had already planned on doing so. Now, Hitt was involved with 2 successful radio deception operations that came after the Saint-Mihiel operation. one called the Lorraine Deception that took place in September 1918, and the other I dubbed the 10th Army Deception that happened during the Meuse-Argonne Offensive in October 1918. The latter was implemented by officers from the 1st Army's G2A6 and signalmen from the collection service that had been subordinated to Hitt's 1st Army Signal Corps. Now, Hitt remained in Europe until July 1919, so he was there a very long time. After the armistice, he was tasked with numerous Signal Corps duties, including holding a spot on the Inter-Allied Radio Telegraphic Conference and another board related to peace negotiations. He served on Pershing's Superior Board. He was one of only 2 non-general officers to do so, and had a stint as the chief signal officer of the 3rd Army in Koblenz, Germany. Though Russell very much encouraged Hitt to switch over to the Signal Corps at this time, he demurred. He preferred to stay in the infantry, partly because he had a poor opinion of the technical skills and abilities of many of the higher-ranking signal officers. I want to share with you this great picture. It comes from the collection of the U.S. Army Intelligence Center of Excellence at Fort Huachuca. It was probably sent there by Mary Lou Hitt when she sent material to them when Hitt was inducted into the Military Intelligence Hall of Honor, I believe in 1988. This shows a party on October 20th, 1918 in Suy, France, in the offices of the Chief Signal Officer of the 1st Army, marking multiple birthdays among the officers and the female telephone operators. Hitt sits at the far right of the shot, and he supplied the signal flag decorations, and his men constructed the dome light decorated with flags and celery leaves and small U.S. and French flags. Great pains were taken to make it a special festive occasion. Food was brought from Paris for a chef that they got from the French aviation camp to cook up for them. There were menu cards with little verses specific to each individual. That's what the woman in the front right is reading. I know it looks like she's glancing at her phone, but she's not. They ate roast goose with stuffing and mushroom sauce and cauliflower, roast potatoes, lobster salad, caviar, fresh fruit, which was a change from the usual dried fruit, celery, nuts, cheese, and cakes. And I love this picture because it's a great picture. It captures the atmosphere of festivity on what was a dreary, rainy day during a short pause in combat operations. And it's so rare to have a picture. The event is described in the diaries of several of the telephone operators. And it's so rare to be able to link up a photograph with written descriptions of the event. And I was happy to be able to share this picture with Elizabeth Copps, the author of the book, The Hello Girls, while she was doing her research, because it is just so evocative of the period and how Hitt ran his command, sort of a happy, companionable mode of command. After the war, Hitt became an instructor at the Army War College in Washington, and then at the end of January 1921, he began what is the most troublesome and controversial portion of his career. In his first assignment as a general staff officer, he became Assistant Chief of Staff for Military Intelligence, the G2, in the 2nd Corps Area Headquarters on Governor's Island in New York City. This picture is a view of Lower Manhattan from Governor's Island in New York Harbor. Now, following World War I, the United States was beset by unrest and perceived threats from labor activists, Bolsheviks, and African Americans. The year 1919 was marked by race riots, strikes, and bombings. In September 1920, an explosion on Wall Street in front of the headquarters of J.P. Morgan, said to be the work of anti-capitalists, killed 30 and injured 300 and could be heard, obviously, from Governor's Island. Now, duties for military intelligence officers in core areas were poorly defined, and the relationship between these officers and the Military Intelligence Division, or MID, in Washington was similarly unclear, creating an unfortunate situation for all involved. They used methods of investigation not designed for peacetime, and they became and remain controversial. The mission of this nascent domestic military intelligence effort was to surveil not just foreign interests, but also domestic organizations suspected of receiving support from hostile powers or threatening the stability of the U.S. government. The MID began targeting American minorities. Soviet Russia the ongoing Russian Civil War and the Communist Internationale were considered threats to the nation. As many American Jews belonged to domestic factions associated with the Internationale, they were therefore targets of military investigation. Organizations campaigning for civil rights for African Americans were also perceived as domestic threats, and many leaders of this movement were similarly targeted. When Hitt received guidance from the MID, he did his best to satisfy Washington's request. He implemented orders to surveil domestic organizations and individual citizens. This work was not limited to minorities, included the industrial workers of the world. The ever-frugal Hitt, whose office had limited funding and was only 2 people, Hitt and an assistant, was always careful to request reimbursement from the MID for books and subscriptions he procured. Budget issues plagued him throughout his tour, and by July, there was no money for investigations or for publications. Hitt's office also handled a sensitive MID allotment that paid the salaries of some of the employees of Herbert O. Yardley's Black Chamber, which was then operating in Manhattan under cover of a private code-making company. When one employee's salary was not included in the April allotment, Hitt intervened and took the money from his own accounts to pay the man, and then requested reimbursement from Washington, of course. Hitt apparently had no personal association with Yardley while in New York. But in addition to domestic surveillance, a good deal of his intelligence work involved the activities of foreign governments. He personally gathered information at social events and tasked the Bureau of Investigation, New York office, to conduct subsequent surveillance. Now, he only was there for 6 months, and this 6 months of service really needs to be looked at for what it was, neither minimized or exaggerated. You know, we all agree in hindsight, the Army's monitoring of domestic minority groups was an infringement of civil rights. And time has also uncovered the extent of racism and anti-Semitism in the Army. But Hitt was a free-thinking, principled man with broad experience, and he apparently did not share these views. His greatest prejudice, I found, were against inefficiency and incompetence. When he was, in July 1921, he was reassigned back to the War College. There's no indication that this was due to a request on his part or the desire of the MID to have somebody else who's better at their job or were dissatisfied with his work. So it's not really unclear. I think it was a need at the War College that brought him back. But the short detail in military intelligence garners Hitt more references in history than any of his other non-cryptologic careers. So you see Hitt mentioned as a cryptologist, and you see him mentioned as an evil intelligence officer in history books. And the rest of his career was just overlooked. So he became famous for work he was doing really outside his chosen area of expertise. After the G2 job in New York, Hitt returned to the War College, and then he went to the 23rd Infantry in San Antonio, and then he returned to the General Staff in Washington. He retired from the Army in 1928 after 30 years of service and was then employed by his old World War I assistant, Sosthenes Bean, who owned and operated the International Telephone and Telegraph Company, IT&T. Here, Hitt undertook a variety of Cipher-related tasks, including development of a rotor-based machine. This is one of the patent drawings. IT&T wanted to sell this machine to the US government, but during evaluation tests in November 1931, it was successfully broken by William Friedman and his team at the new Army Signal Intelligence Service. Hitt's reaction was amazement and awe, and he asked for permission to congratulate Friedman's team. Frank Rowlett, a member of the team, wrote, "When we had assembled, Colonel Hitt made a short and somewhat formal speech of congratulations, in which he stated that he was disappointed that his invention did not offer the high degree of security that he had expected of it. But he was personally gratified to learn that the War Department had developed a cryptanalytic capability powerful enough to solve in such a short time a cipher machine that he had considered to be impregnable." Rowlett continued, "Hitt must have felt great disappointment at having his invention proved unsatisfactory in such a short time, but he never let it show for an instant." Interestingly, the plans for this machine were shared with IT&T's German subsidiary, the Lawrence Company, and Hitt's machine became an early predecessor of the Lawrence machine we now know as Tunny, which was used to encipher high-level communications of the Third Reich. Hitt would have been horrified to know that. Hitt's machine also contributed ideas to Friedman's thought process as he worked with Rowlett and others to develop the US Cipher device that became known as SIGABA. A health crisis in early 1932, combined with financial troubles at IT&T, left Hitt retired again that year. He could not find permanent work, but engaged in a variety of activities, including working with the American Cryptogram Association, writing, and other hobbies. In September 1939, he requested a return to active duty in the Army, and in the fall of 1940, he was assigned to be Chief Signal Officer of the 5th Corps area at Fort Hays in Columbus, Ohio. The picture on the left was taken at this time. In the autumn of 1943, Hitt, who is now a year older than the mandatory Army retirement age of 64, retired again. So I'm running out of time, but Hitt's story is not yet over. Mary Lou went to work at Arlington Hall Station as a code girl in 1944. Hitt attended the inauguration of his old friend Eisenhower in 1953. He maintained a regular correspondence with Friedman. Genevieve died in 1963, just before David Kahn began visiting Hitt to gather materials for a book he was writing. In February 1971, the 92-year-old fell and broke his hip. He died in the hospital at Front Royal on March 2nd, 1971, with Mary Lou by his side. But what about Mary Lou? Mary Louise Hitt, always called Mary Lou, was born on August 12, 1912, in San Antonio. Genevieve had gone home to give birth under the supervision of her father, a doctor with an obstetrics practice. Parker took leave from his teaching duties to be there and suggested that her cradle be put in his study where he could rock her while listening to the radio set while Genevieve slept. The picture on the upper right shows Parker and Mary Lou. Mary Lou was wearing a headset to listen to the radio. Got to train them young, right? She called her parents Park or Parker and Gigi, which was Genevieve's nickname, rather than father and mother, and had a rather freewheeling childhood. She was devoted to her parents and lived with them until their death. On the lower left, the picture shows 6-year-old Mary Lou on a Harley Davidson at Fort Sam Houston in 1918. If you look closely, you can see a doll stuck in the handlebars. In the fall of 1944, Mary Lou, who had worked for the Army while they were stationed in Columbus, wanted to return to work. So Parker called William Friedman on the evening of October 23, 1944, to see if he had a place for his daughter. A little over 2 weeks later, on November 9th, before her background paperwork had even been completed, she was sworn in at Arlington Hall Station and took up residence at Arlington Farms. She worked in the traffic analysis and control office there. Friedman summoned her to tea a month later and showed her Parker's original sliding strip device, discussed various Cipher issues, including the study group he was running about the Voynich manuscript, and they gossiped about Herbert O. Yardley. Though Mary Lou was talented in cryptanalysis, having been trained as being a young child, she did not stay on after the surrender of Japan. She didn't like office work, and she returned home to look after Genevieve, who was ill. Later on, she helped organize some of Parker's papers to send to David Kahn and worked to preserve her parents' legacy. She died in 1997. So, was Friedman correct in his assessment of Hitt? As we've learned, Friedman first learned of Hitt when he read Hitt's manual using the book to train officers in 1917 and 1918. He had hoped to meet Hitt in 1917, but instead met with Genevieve when Parker was en route to France. They first met in Chaumont, France in the summer of 1918 when Friedman was a newly arrived second lieutenant and Hitt was on the verge of becoming chief signal officer of the First Army. Friedman hero worshipped Hitt and looked for every opportunity to seek his opinion and advice. Friedman witnessed, albeit at a slight distance and sometimes secondhand, the influence Hitt had on the three-part AEF cryptologic organization. At the time, the men running these organizations did not realize they were devising the principles of the future American cryptologic system. Many collection and analytic principles of future developed for the AEF can be seen in later American cryptologic work during the Second World War. Friedman was responsible for gathering up the work done in France and spent years cultivating the memory of the work that was done there. He used that organization and the lessons learned when he set up the Signal Intelligence Service in 1930. That organization later became the Signal Security Agency, and then the Army Security Agency, and was folded into the Armed Forces Security Agency in 1949, which of course then becomes the National Security Agency in 1952. So Hitt, while rarely directly involved in most aspects of World War I cryptology, nevertheless heavily influenced and guided the work. And this is what Friedman remembered and commemorates in his 1957 inscription. And after all, who are we to quarrel with Friedman's assessment? So I've only really been able to skim the surface of Hitt's long life and career. There's much more to be found in my book, which I hope you'll purchase and read and enjoy. And I'll share the news with you that my book, From the Ground Up, American Cryptology During World War I, should be released by NSA's Center for Cryptologic History later this year after many years of delay due to unforeseeable issues, including the pandemic. It will be a free government publication available in PDF, and I'll try to let people know when it's released. I don't have the cover art yet, but I've chosen a picture here of a mobile direction finding truck developed by the AEF in September 1918. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
For those of you who have questions, I'd ask you to use the question and answer icon, and I'll pass them over to Betsy. As you look through, we can drop the slides if you want, unless you want to go back to them. Okay. As you look back, you indicated that Pershing valued his work. Otherwise, Pershing wouldn't have gone yelled at Bliss. But did Pershing help him advance, or was he just someone that he used? I don't use
now. Well, Pershing did put him in for promotion. I mean, he was promoted rapidly. Of course, he was in the regular army, and then he became a member of the National Army while in the AEF. So he was immediately promoted from captain to major in the National Army, then quickly to lieutenant colonel, and then to colonel by September 1918. Pershing put him in for promotion to general twice in the fall of 1918. And I'm convinced if the war had continued into 1919, Hitt probably would have been a brigadier general. Of course, he would have lost that rank almost immediately after returning home, as most Army officers did at that time. But it's hard to know whether it was he just got lost in the shuffle, whether it's because it was a signal corps position and he was an infantry officer holding a signal corps job, and they looked out for the signal corps men, and many signal corps men got promoted to brigadier general, but Hitt did not, despite having, frankly, more important jobs than some of them. So don't know. I don't know how. I mean, he obviously knew Pershing relatively well. He knew Russell very well, and Russell was very close to Pershing, but I don't know that, what Pershing's real opinion was.
This question is from Joe. Joe asks, you indicated he had a relationship with Eisenhower, but did he lose touch with Eisenhower as Eisenhower advanced?
Well, they did sort of lose touch. I mean, they were in touch periodically. When Eisenhower was at Camp Meade in 1920 and the Hitts were at the War College, they saw a lot of each other. The families socialized frequently. They came to a house party at the Hitts and maybe wrote about that. And Genevieve baked a cake for Icky's birthday. So they knew the family well, and they saw the Eisenhowers later when they visited Panama, I think in 1923. When Hitt is writing about his experience in Lake Lanao in the mid-1930s, or 1937, he writes to Ike, who's in the Philippines, asking him to gather information for him about the current use of the boats. on Lake Lanao. So he's sort of tasking Eisenhower with things, but they do grow a little bit more distant. Mamie wintered in San Antonio, and Genevieve knew her when she was pregnant with Icky. So I think they had some closeness there, but Mamie and Ike were a little bit younger than the Hitts. There's a story David Kahn tells in The Codebreakers of Ike, the Hitts waking up one morning in Front Royal and finding Ike sprawled across the couch and during the war, but this can never have happened. I've extensively worked with the Eisenhower Library, and this seems to be something Mary Lou remembered that might have been from an earlier decade. But the Eisenhower, they were on the Eisenhower's Christmas card lists, and they had some correspondence, but they clearly were not in their close circle.
You talked about finding papers down in Northern Virginia somewhere. Where are those papers today?
They are still with the Mustaine and Mormon family in Front Royal, and they are working on deciding where they want to donate Hitt's material. They have no children, and they're contemplating their options for donation. Okay. So I'd like to see the papers themselves. They gave Mary Lou and Parker gave a lot of papers to David Kahn, and they form the core of David Kahn's Parker Hitt papers, which are held now by the National Cryptologic Museum Library. And I'd like to see Hitt's papers all reunited together there. But ultimately, it's the decision of the owners rather than me.
I spend the same time doing that type of stuff also, trying to get collections in.
Yeah.
Why do you think he got forgotten?
I think there are many reasons. I think he did not have a great ambition to be a general. I mean, he said at one point that if anybody gave him stars, he'd take them because he enjoyed the money and that it would bring him. But I think he did not have a burning ambition to higher rank, because if he had switched to the Signal Corps, it's quite possible he could have been chief signal officer in the 1930s. I don't know if there was maybe he didn't work the system. He wasn't political. He was friendly with people. He does not seem to have gossiped about people or written about people. He didn't, he enjoyed life. He enjoyed doing what he wanted to do. His early career is really characterized by taking assignments that let him do the things he liked to do. And, maybe down deep in the Army, that just wasn't what they wanted. But why he's forgotten by history, because he knew so many people and they don't seem to write about him. But then again, he doesn't write about very many people either. So
going back to his papers, how extensive do they talk about his experiences in the Philippines?
He kept a diary for quite a number of years while in the Philippines, and it's fairly detailed but fairly mundane as well. It tracks very well with the existing 22nd Infantry records of the time in the Philippines. It gives a little personal angle on them, the letters he was getting, and a little bit about what he was doing there.
You ever mention Matthew Batson? Batson won a Medal of Honor. He wasn't in the infantry. He was a cavalry guy. He was in 9th Cavalry.
If he wasn't in the 22nd, he probably isn't in the diary. Yeah.
Well, the 22nd was one of my regiments while I served.
Oh, okay.
It's good to see a gentleman from the 22nd succeed. When do you expect the next book out?
I am hoping to see the final proofs this week or next. And then shortly after that, the soft copy will be released online, and then they will send it to print. So I'm really hoping, if there's no great crisis or tragedy, that it happens. I wrote this book. I retired in 2017. I went back part-time in 2018 to produce a couple of volumes, including this, for the center, and left in November 2018, leaving them the manuscript and all the permissions and the illustrations and everything. And then there were a couple of personnel issues, and then of course COVID, and it's ended up taking 4 years to get this out, but I'll be glad to see it out.
How challenging is it working through the declassification, even of some of this stuff? Does some of this stuff still cause you headaches?
No, all of this is unclassified. I mean, it is a little challenging in the timing of things because you have to allow time for it to go for pre-publication review, but there really is nothing in Hitt's life or Hitt's work or the World War I cryptologic work that is classified in any way and hasn't been for decades. So
that sliding scale looks very familiar with what I used to use out in the field. So I guess
yeah,
that's pre all the secure devices they have now.
It's pretty much a basic device, isn't it? It's not extremely difficult at the time when even less secure material was being used, code and cipher things. It was a little bit more revolutionary, but the machine age, the rotor-based devices take over in the 20s and 30s, like the Enigma, and then it becomes obsolete. So
if someone wanted to do research on some of these topics, how difficult is to get into the center?
You can't get into the center. There is material at the National Cryptologic Museum Library. They have an extensive declassified collection, and there is an extensive NSA record group of declassified material at the National Archives. It's record group 457 at College Park, and the only difficulty there now, of course, is you still need to make an appointment. You can't just wander down.
That's true. What would you like to say in closing?
I just appreciate everybody who's been interested in this book. It's been a really, Hitt has sort of engulfed my life since about 2007. So for 15 years, I had hopes of telling his story, because really Hitt is everywhere. When I was doing research for anything else, he had a very distinctive signature, and I'd open a folder, turn a page, and there's Parker Hitt. And to me, it was just amazing that somebody who did so much and was so critical in his time had just vanished from the record. And so I'm really pleased to be able to put his story forward.
Well, thank you for helping us learn a little bit about another soldier, and good luck with the next book, and then the book after that, how it works, right?
We'll see. I have a couple of ideas, but we'll see what happens.
Okay. Thanks again. I'd like to let folks know we'll be doing another one of these talks on the 5th of October, again at 7 p.m. Eastern. It's called At First Light, a true World War II story of a hero, his bravery, and an amazing horse. It's a story by Walt Lattimore. He's a doctor, but he's going to tell the story of his father, who served with the 3rd Infantry Division during World War II in the Italian theater. So I look forward to having you come back here in about another week. So again, Betsy, thanks very much. Come on up and visit sometime. We're not too far away.
It's been a while since I've been up to Carlisle, but I will get back.
Well, you got to make an appointment here too now. So we'll see you soon. Okay. Thank you. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight.